Guys, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Just turn the mic on. Today we're going to be looking at the idea of evil, pain, and suffering. And this is a bit of a different class or a different topic, I guess, than maybe some of the other things that we've been discussing so far, in the way that it's not so much necessarily. Well, I'm not going to say that. I was going to say it's not an evidence for God, but I think actually as we work through it, it does prove in some ways to be a way that we can show evidence for God. But really, the idea here is that the idea of evil, pain, and suffering is something that people often use as an objection to the existence of God. I kind of broke it down on the first slide here. So the problem of evil, a common objection raised against the existence of God. And it can be summed up in a pretty simple, kind of three-statement argument. If God is, as the Bible states, omnipotent, so all-powerful, and also perfect in goodness, so he's both perfectly powerful and perfectly good, and yet evil still exists, that therefore disproves the existence of God in the eyes of many. In the eyes of many, you can't reconcile these two things. How can God be perfectly good and perfectly powerful, and yet there still be evil that exists in the world? If he was perfectly good, he would get rid of the evil, or if he was perfectly powerful, he would have the power to destroy all the evil in the world, or something to that effect is the argument that people would make. So I guess just right off the bat here, before we even get into some of the kind of logical argument that I want us to go through this morning as we kind of talk through this topic, I want to ask, how would you address this argument if it arose with a friend or a coworker or someone who you're talking to about spiritual things, and they say, well, I just don't believe in God because of all the evil that exists in the world. I just don't see how there can be a God if there is all this evil and bad things that exist in the world. Again, this is kind of just to kind of get your thoughts and preliminary discussion, but what would be how would you address this kind of question with someone? I think, Blake, are you getting the comment thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on one second, Kelly.
I like the way you did it earlier. The first thing I would do would be turn the mic on.
Yeah.
I was going to say it twice, but I figured it wouldn't come on.
Yeah.
The first question I would ask is, how do you know that there's evil? The idea that for change to happen, there has to be a constant.
Yep.
So you can't see something unless there's something stable to compare it to.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's great. I think that's actually the direction that I want to head with the class today. That's kind of the first question I would ask as well. Is where does evil come from? If or how would you even define what evil is or is not if there is no God? That's great, Kelly. Richard.
Yeah. So I guess the way I've thought about it in the past is, why shouldn't evil exist? Like, why does the existence of God necessitate, in your mind, that evil doesn't exist at all?
Right.
Like, where does that come from?
Right.
That has to come from a paradigm that I don't subscribe to.
Right.
I don't believe that.
So what do you think that paradigm is that people would subscribe to that you're describing?
I really don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, they're living in a world where in their mind, if this kind of God exists, then evil can't. And I don't understand the logic behind that.
Right.
They arrive at that some way, so that's how I'll kind of try to frame the discussions. Let's figure out where you're coming from, so you're arriving at that conclusion.
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's a good point in general for how to address these kinds of objections or questions. Is first of all, you got to figure out where that person is coming from, because, and I think we'll show this in the course of the class today. At least I hope we will. I think that in the end, when you boil it down to where this argument comes from, it comes from a different perspective on God and who He is and His responsibility in the world and all that kind of stuff. In the end, that's the biggest kind of paradigm to what Richard is saying is, who is God? What is His perspective on the world and how it works and all of that? And hopefully we'll be able to kind of differentiate how we would view God and then how someone who believes this line of thinking might view God. Is the microphone working okay? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Any other things that you would think to raise or address, or questions you might ask to someone who would raise this kind of question? Blake?
I think one of the maybe just keep in mind what we mentioned at the very beginning of this whole study is like one of the proofs of God is a sense of morality.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about good or evil, right or wrong, anything like that, that does bring up, it does take us back to, if that exists, if there is good or evil, then what does that alone say? Now we can talk about the type of God that we're discussing, and if you like this type of God that allows evil, even though he is all powerful and he is all good, but the existence of God can't be determined just because there is evil. You just might not like or be fond of this God that I'm presenting.
Right. Yeah, it kind of does come down to the concept of who this God is and what is being presented, what is being communicated about that God. And I think that, I think to kind of both Richard and Blake's points, I think that the way that we present that to someone will make a big difference in this kind of argument. And if someone has this kind of objection, is really you're trying to help show them what you believe about this God and what that really looks like and what that means. All right. Any other thoughts on this first question here? All right. So the second question that I have in the lesson material is kind of to the point that Richard was making earlier about the existence of morality, or the existence of a right and wrong. So if evil exists, if we are going to take the assumption that is made here in this, logical argument that is being made here by a skeptic or someone who believes this problem of evil argument, if we're going to take the opinion that evil does exist, what other conclusions are we then forced to draw if evil does exist? Anna?
I think if you're going to acknowledge that evil exists, then you also have to acknowledge that there's good,
Mm-hmm.
and you also have to acknowledge that how do we know that there's good and evil?
Yeah.
That somehow we have an innate ability to know what's good and evil.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That's kind of the first bullet that I had here, is that if evil exists, we're forced to accept that there are objective moral values. There's some kind of higher moral value system that exists outside of us. Kind of to what Anna was just saying, this is not you can't say that like evil exists and then say that there isn't the complement good, and then if both of those are there, okay, well then how are those things determined? How do we determine what is actually good or evil? And I think that often people would probably make the argument that, well, society determines that, or that's just determined by, the greatest common good, or there's probably a lot of different ways of thinking through how evil and good might be determined. But I think that the point of what we're going through today, and hopefully the point that we'll see in these through these questions, is that really that objective moral value system can only be and should only be determined by a higher power, and I think in a lot of ways necessitates the existence of that higher power. I'll get to that quote in a second. Kelly?
To the idea that society would determine moral values, you have societies that human sacrifice or the killing of other tribes is the moral value of that society. And
Yeah.
These things are definitely evil in spite of the fact that the societies approve of them or actually are exalted in their own eyes by these things.
Right.
The morality cannot come, the sense of ought, as you're probably going to get to there in a minute, doesn't come from people saying this is good, because that's relative to what society decides is going to be good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think whatever metric or whatever, ruler we decide to use when it comes to this, in an earthly sense, when it comes to this idea of good and evil, of what is moral, what is right and wrong, it's going to fall short at some point. Whether it is, let's just do whatever is the the best for the majority of people. Well, I think we've all seen examples of where that has been a failure in the past. Or to what Kelly said, whatever society, our current society deems as right or wrong. I think that over and over again, those earthly metrics for proving what is evil or good have been proven to be lacking, have been proven to be less than ideal. And I think that necessitates the existence of there being something higher, something greater, something that is within all of us that we can appeal to in terms of what this higher morality would look like. Any other thoughts on this question about what other conclusions we are forced to draw if evil does exist?
Would you consider the fact that it's universal as something that we would have to consider? The fact that it's universal?
That evil is universal? Yeah.
That we're no different from, I said a minute ago, something about tribes, and I was looking back.
Right.
Two centuries to things that would happen then that don't necessarily happen in our society. So,
Yeah.
Well, our society is different from that. We don't do that. So therefore, societies can produce this. But you made the same point there, that we do have things in our society that are deemed good that may not be.
Right. So are you saying by the universal nature of evil that even in like societies where they would not understand God in the same way that we do, there is still a concept of evil there? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, and that it exists in all societies.
Yeah.
It's pervasive throughout humankind.
Right. Yeah. It's consistent throughout. There's not like a gap in some society that just has no concept of right or wrong. That is consistent throughout. Yeah, that's a good point.
So, I kind of want to bring out that if you're having this discussion with someone and they do believe that evil exists, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But you want to try to get someone to that point.
Right.
Because, I don't know if you guys remember Richard Dawkins a few years ago. And he's this famous atheist.
Yeah.
And he came out and publicly said, hey, I was molested as a child. And the guy who did it is not guilty. He didn't do anything wrong. Because the reason that you are looking at him wrong is because you're judging him with today's morals, and he lived in a different time, and all of this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that attitude of what's right should only guide us right now, and you can't, and that's going to change tomorrow.
Yeah.
So there is no, in that world, there is no objective evil. There's only what I should do today, and that might be different tomorrow.
Right.
That's a whole different battle to fight
Yeah.
than if you're having a discussion with someone who actually does believe evil exists,
Right.
and it is objectively evil.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is eventually the choice. If you are someone who believes in this argument of the problem of evil, it's kind of the choice that you're eventually forced to make is either I believe in the existence of God, or if I'm going to say that God does not exist, I must then also claim that there is no good and evil. There is no right and wrong. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that to the normal, lay person, saying that evil does not exist would be a pretty bold statement to make, and most people would not agree with that. So if you can at least form some kind of common ground with someone to be able to say, all right, let's agree that evil, good and evil do exist in the world. They're out there. I think that you formed a good foundation, and you'll at least be able to hopefully make someone question what they're talking about a little bit. I had a quote here from C.S. Lewis. This is from his book, from Mere Christianity. And at one point, C.S. Lewis was not a believer. He was an atheist, and he attributes part of his disbelief to this problem of evil. He saw the evil that was in the world. He couldn't understand how that matched up with the God of the Bible that he was reading about. I'll just read this quote because I think it's really helpful to kind of get some perspective on some of the things that we're talking about here. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how'd I got this idea of just and unjust? Man does not call a line crooked some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own," kind of to the point that Richard was making about evil becoming non-existent. But if I did that, if I gave up this idea of justice, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. So C.S. Lewis is making the same point that Richard just made, in that if you accept that evil and the idea of justice and injustice and things being right and wrong, that exists and that is a real part of our world, by that statement, it necessitates some kind of higher power, some kind of God that is the one who is determining what is just and what is unjust. And I think to what Richard was saying before as well, that's a really good starting point to have in this kind of discussion with someone, is to say, all right, let's at least have common ground here and decide and agree that there is some kind of objective truth that we're all called back to. Tim, you had a comment?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's easier perhaps to prove that there's evil in the world. I think it's a lot more difficult to prove that there's good in the world. So I think one of the big things that we need to take by saying that there is evil in the world is, I don't think we necessarily need to prove that, but I guess it leads to a lot of questions for me. It's like, is good equally as powerful as evil, or is evil more powerful than good?
Yeah.
And I think those are perhaps more foundationally important or interesting questions than why does evil exist?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't even really know how to answer that. It's a tough one, and it's very, I think it is very foundational. But I think if you can at least get someone to agree that that moral system does exist, and that there is some kind of like moral objective value system, that's going to be a good starting point. Kelly?
The idea that there is no pure evil, that evil is only a distortion of good, is an important aspect. I'm not giving you an answer to this. I'm kind of raising an additional question as Tim was.
Yeah.
How do we prove good? Well, and is evil more powerful than good? It's easier to pervert good than it is to make good.
Sure. But you can't even have that discussion, this whole discussion about what is greater, what is less powerful, without agreeing that in some form or fashion it exists. Like there is good and there is evil out there. Where the balance is, I think that's a little bit more of a fundamental, theological discussion probably. But I think that what we're trying to show here is just like there is this value system that does exist, and if that is the case, that necessitates there being something greater than that. Any other thoughts on this question? I would love to go into that more, but I think it's a little bit off from what we're talking about right here. Any other thoughts? All right. So the conclusion that I had to this question was that the existence of evil proves that some higher moral authority must exist. So the third question, so let's think about this a little bit more. If we're making the conclusion that we are about evil, I think there's more objections that people would raise other than just evil. There's the idea of pain and suffering being something that exists in our world as well. It's the title of this lesson: evil, pain, and suffering. So if we've addressed evil in some way, someone could still argue that well, there's all this pain and suffering in the world. Maybe there is a higher moral value or higher moral system that exists, but how do you level with the idea that there is still so much pain, still so much suffering that God allows to happen? How does that work out? So my question here is all pain and suffering a bad thing? And if not, how do we determine what is good and bad in terms of pain and suffering? Any thoughts on that, guys?
If you fall off a ladder and break your arm, it teaches you to be more careful with ladders, so it's not always bad.
Yeah, Kelly said if you fall off a ladder and break your arm, you're taught a valuable lesson. The one who does not fall off the ladder is also taught that same lesson, so it works out for everybody. But Richard?
So, for me, my mind is in a very different place when I think of pain and suffering than evil. So, when I think of pain and suffering, I think of like the stumbling blocks. Jesus said, "Stumbling blocks will come, but woe to the man by whom they come." Right?
Yeah.
So there's an instigator and there's a person who suffers the stumble.
Right.
You're going to stumble, get back up. But I'm looking at this guy who made you stumble, and I'm going after him. It's kind of like what Jesus is saying.
Right.
To him. So, pain and suffering, it's kind of the same thing. Like when you look at it, just I'm suffering pain, right, or I'm suffering in some way. Well, it's only good or bad how I perceive it.
Right.
I mean, 90% is going to be total perception,
Right.
right? If my muscles hurt, and I'm a crybaby. Well, then I'm going to look at it in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
If my muscles hurt because I've been in the gym and I'm trying to be a world-class weightlifter, I'm going to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
I broke them down. Good. They're rebuilding, right?
Right.
Now, that's not all pain and suffering. But the person if someone causes me pain and suffering, then we get back to the problem of evil.
Right. Yeah.
So just the fact that I feel pain
Yeah.
or I suffer, the vast majority of the time it's good or bad based on my perception
Yeah.
purely.
Yep.
How do I respond?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that is a really good point. And I think that a lot of the pain and suffering that someone who would raise this question and would continue down this line of thinking would probably go with is maybe that 10% that you're talking about, where it seems like there is no way for me to logically or reasonably with my own perception work through and figure out, okay, what is the greater good that's accomplished here? Like, because I kind of thought the same thing when I thought about this. If I go to the gym, it is painful and some kind of suffering in that moment to do the exercises that I'm doing. It's not always a pleasant experience. However, I know that the end result is going to be better. And so maybe that is that 90% category that Richard's describing. I think where people, and probably where all of us probably struggle more, is with that 10%, with things like, natural disasters that just seem to kill at random. There are just hundreds or thousands of people who die for no apparent reason, or a child who gets cancer. Who does that benefit? How could someone so young and so innocent going through so much pain? How could that be a good thing? How can that ever be like something that is acceptable or brought about for a certain reason or anything like that? And I think that's where where people will often struggle with that question. Tim?
And I don't know if this is worth mentioning or if it's just going to be like a wrench in things. But I guess this whole theory kind of breaks down when you're discussing somebody who believes in a dharmic religion. Specifically like Buddhism or I think to a greater degree Hinduism, or I don't even know if James is Sikh. So I guess the thing is with them is they believe in karma, right? And karma is simply the law of cause and effect, and it's a cosmic law that transcends time and space. And so there's not one who, well, in the Hindu system there is, but in the Buddhist there isn't. There's not some individual who determines what is good and accumulates good karma in an individual, and what's bad and accumulates bad karma in an individual. So it's like bad intentions always lead to bad actions, always lead to bad coming back upon you.
Right.
And so then they also, by virtue thereof, they think that lifetimes of karma are built up in individuals. With Hindus, there is no salvation from the karmic cycle.
Yeah.
But with Buddhists, there is. So ultimately, the goal in game of the Buddhist is to, I don't really understand personally the end game of the Buddhist, but it's the idea of over several lifetimes, you will eventually escape the karmic cycle. So that to them solves this problem. So when a young child gets sick and dies, it's because of something that happened in a former lifetime that they're finally receiving their due penance for.
Right.
And I mean, I guess the one thing though that we can take away from this, at least in regards to this discussion that we're having now, is that Buddhists and to a lesser extent Hindus and Christians kind of have at least one thing kind of going in the same direction, in as much as if it's not going to be solved in this lifetime, it'll be solved in the next one.
Sure.
Which is a largely unsatisfactory answer to a naturalist or to an Buddhists are largely atheists by virtue of they don't believe in any kind of God or creator. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I think too there is a very real subset of atheists here in the United States that are more or less apathetic to suffering in as much as they understand that it exists and they don't really care.
Yeah.
Because I think they understand there's a futility. And that's really, I guess, what I'm getting to is with suffering and pain for the atheist is it's a futile exercise that
Right.
leads to, which really, I guess, answers question number 3, is that pain and suffering to the atheist is ultimately worthless to them because nothing
It's
good
kind of
ever
neutral.
comes.
I mean, if anything, it's if you're an atheist, you can't really say that pain or suffering is either good or bad,
That's true.
because really, in the end, all that it is doing is furthering the process of natural selection. I mean, maybe that's the only good thing that is coming of it, but really, like, you have no way of saying, is it actually something that is good or is bad in the end? And Blake, you had a
Yeah.
comment?
So my question would be for someone that wants to use pain and suffering in, as far as not what someone does to inflict pain and suffering on someone else, but like natural disasters, something like that. My question would be, left by itself, if you don't believe in an intelligent designer and creator, does this world build up and evolve, or does it break down and destroy?
Right.
Because you can't explain everything we see around us by saying that there's a building up and then moving forward, but then as soon as something bad does happen, left to its own devices, this world also destroys.
Yeah.
Well, which one is it?
Right.
If we are just like specks in whatever, and this universe is it just happened, and this world just happened. I mean, how do we get to this point where we are now? Well, part of the explanation would have to be that's just how it happened over time.
Yeah.
So we went so there was nothing, and then, or something very small, and now there's something so great and grand, and there was no creator.
Right.
Okay. Well, then now how does it go the other way?
Yeah.
While it's still moving forward in other ways.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to make sense unless you believe in some sort of just balance that is out there in the universe. And even then, you can't have a sense of good or bad because you have to always admit that it is level.
Right.
And we know that's not true.
Right.
Like, no one really is being true to themselves if they believe that.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very easy to, no, and I don't want to say very easy because that seems dismissive, but I think that it is, it's an interesting conversation to have with someone to kind of try to poke holes in this line of thinking, because it's fairly easy to poke holes, because I think it's easy to look out in the world around us and see how things happen, see, just see the way that things work, and to be able to speak against that to someone. So before we move on to question 4, we've talked about kind of all these things already, but basically our outlook outlook on whether suffering is good or bad is often determined by the result. It's kind of like what Richard was saying earlier, which at most times we won't know until after the fact. In that 10% of the time when we don't know what the result is going to be, that's when it becomes hard to answer that question of, all right, why is this happening? How could this happen? And so the conclusion here would be pain and suffering isn't always a bad thing, and our perspective on that is often dictated by whatever the result is, whether we can see that result or not. I think it's kind of interesting, going back to what Tim was saying about the idea of karma. I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in questions 4 and 5. I want us to look a little bit at God's interaction with Job and kind of consider that. But I think we can even if we don't necessarily subscribe to a karmic. Is that what karmic? Okay. If we don't subscribe to a karmic way of thinking, I think we can oftentimes start thinking that way when we think, all right, well, if something bad happened to me, it must be the result of this, or it must be the result of that. And I think that alone should show us that our perspective on that result, or on whatever the cause or effect of our suffering is, or the suffering of others, is limited. Like we really don't know in the end what is the result that is going to happen, what is going to come out of that, what is going to be made from our suffering, whether that's good or bad. Richard, you had a thought?
Yeah, Robin texted, he said, evil is manifested from within, therefore natural destruction is not necessarily evil.
Yeah.
It's just an event.
Yeah. Evil is manifested from within. Yeah, it's something that comes from within us ourselves. It's not something that is necessarily an external force. That was actually kind of the way that I wanted to approach this lesson when I first started thinking about it. I was like, all right, well, let's think about the source of evil. Let's think about where evil comes from. And I kind of wanted to talk about like sin and how that is the root of all evil, and how that would kind of come from within us. But and I think that's a good way of thinking about this as well. That would be a part of this conversation that you would probably want to have with someone. But I think that you got to lay the groundwork first of, all right, let's address these questions that you have. Let's address like these objections before we even get into how a Christian would view the source of evil or that kind of thing. Yeah, Tim.
I think too, you and Robin both hit on two aspects of the same point. I think, and this is kind of what I think that karmic philosophy and humanists have in common, is that they're limited in their understanding only to cause and effect.
Right.
I think a good counterexample of cause and effect being unreliable, because I think we need to level with people where they're at, and this would be something they can relate to. Somebody winning the lottery, is that a good event or a bad event? Well, it's very difficult to say, because typically you think, well, if they had good karma, if there's a good effect, then their cause was inherently good. But when people win the lottery, more often than not, they end up more broke, miserable, and alone than before. So it's kind of like, so was them winning the lottery a result of good karma, or was it a result of bad karma? Was it a result of good cause leading to good effect, or was it bad cause leading to bad effect?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, that's just kind of another way to look at it.
Yeah. I think it goes to show that our perspective is just very limited. Even something like you're saying that seems very apparently good, like winning all this money, having fame and fortune and success and all that, while that might on surface level seem to be a very good thing, a lot of times it turns out to have a bad result, or it would be seen as not a good thing at all. So yeah, I think that speaks to our limited perspective, and really like our inability to see past our own present condition, our own present state. And I think that's what we'll kind of touch on in question 5, is really why God is more suited to be the one who is determining whether these things are good or bad, more than man. But I want to go on to question 4. So question 4 is, can pain or suffering have a greater purpose? We talked about this a little bit already, but I kind of want us to just think about this for ourselves. So for the Christian, this is answered pretty clearly in Scripture. I'm not going to read these passages, but I put them up here just for y'all to reference, and if you had a chance to look over the lesson before, maybe you have some thoughts. But I think that for a Christian, this is a pretty clear and simple answer, that in multiple different places in the Scripture, God very clearly outlines and says, whatever suffering you're going through, whatever is happening, this is happening for a greater purpose. The passage in 1 Peter talks about this progression of things that come from the Christian. In Romans 5, where it says, suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope. All these things that flow out of suffering that we would consider to be good things. And so I think that for the Christian, this is a pretty clear and easy statement to make, that pain and suffering do have a greater purpose. But for the non-Christian, or for someone who is an unbeliever, the point might still be made, and this is kind of what I was trying to raise with what Richard was saying earlier. While it is easy to say at times that, okay, I can see that, all right, this suffering that I'm going through right now, this is going to build my character. This is going to really help me hope more. This is going to, do whatever. There are also going to be times where suffering seems pointless, or suffering seems unnecessary, or where there is no ability to see something greater than that. What can be the greater purpose in that instance? Any thoughts on this idea of suffering having a greater purpose? I realize I just kind of asked like 2 or 3 questions there. So, but any thoughts on this idea of suffering having a greater purpose?
Well, what would be like an example of pointless suffering, I guess? Like, what would be the argument there? Because, like I said, we would say that none of it is really pointless or unnecessary. So, like, what would be the argument? I guess I'm just, like, wondering what somebody would say is, oh, this is pointless and unnecessary suffering.
Right. So I think that kind of goes back to what Richard was saying earlier about like the 90% and the 10%. So most of the time, things that we suffer, things that we struggle with, we can see the end result, or we can see like, all right, this is terrible right now, but I know it's going to be better for me in the end. I think that the examples of pointless or unnecessary suffering that I would raise, or that that someone who subscribes to this way of thinking might raise, are the things that are just hard to understand why they happen. Things like natural disasters that kill hundreds of thousands of people, or a child having cancer, or things like that. Like, I think it's hard to reconcile those things and to say, all right, what is the point of that? Like, it seems really hard to kind of figure out what the end result is in those situations. I'm not saying that I view it that way, but I'm saying I think that's how people could see those things. Blake, and then Richard.
So the example that I thought of is, take an innocent child dying.
Yeah.
But you can, and with what we're talking about, evil, pain, and suffering. So you can see how there's one situation where many children, even in the Bible, died at the hands of an evil ruler, right? Well, can we say that's an unnecessary or pointless suffering? But then we also look at something like a tornado ripping through Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and taking out a children's hospital or something like that, where all these, so like, I think that's my example. I think it's still the question is, what are we talking about with pointless or unnecessary? Are we saying the actions of somebody that led to this suffering, but we recognize it's pointless? Or are we saying something that's unexplainable because we don't know why this happened, and it's not a person that did it, it's just this happened?
I think it could be either of those. I mean, I think whether it's a person who is doing something and we just don't understand what the reason is, or whether it's an uncontrollable natural event that happens, I think that both of those would fall into this category. Does that make sense?
No, I'm saying like you had the question. So what were you thinking of when you asked the question?
When I asked the question of like what is pointless?
What is pointless and unnecessary suffering? Yeah.
Right. So I think that, and I want to get to Richard and Tim's comments in a second too, but I think that to me that the basically like the same line of thinking when it comes to the existence of evil is applied here as well. Basically, if you are going to say that there is pointless or unnecessary suffering, someone has to determine what is pointless and unnecessary. And we only have so much experience and perspective as humans to be able to determine what that actually is. So really the question itself being raised is also kind of the answer in a way, is because no one can really determine what is like pointless or unnecessary. You and I's definitions of that could look different. Mine and Tim's or Anna's definitions could all look different when it comes to that. And that's where, when we get to question 5, the idea of God being better suited to make that determination than us is I think part of the answer here. Does that help?
I was just asking what you meant.
Okay, yeah, that was the kind of what I was going for. Richard and then Tim.
So Paulette stole my remarks. I'm going to read hers instead of mine. For the Christian, suffering that seems pointless reminds us that earthly physical things are part of this earthly realm.
Mm.
It provides a contrast to the spiritual realm that we hope for.
Yeah,
So in that way, there is no pointless suffering at all.
right.
Robin said, I think you have to separate evil from misfortune. Back in Jesus' day, religious people erroneously equated suffering and misfortune with evil or sinfulness. Right?
Yeah,
You think of the tower that fell and the Galileans whose blood was mingled with their sacrifices.
yeah,
Jesus said they weren't worse sinners than anyone else.
yeah.
Angela,
Just
so
come in.
suffering always produces some good for the believer. We can only trust God for the end effect. It's not always possible to see it short term, and that's the hard part.
Yeah. I think all of that speaks to the perspective that we're able to have as Christians about what suffering looks like, what it is, how the end result plays out, all those kinds of things. But when we talk about these things with someone who doesn't have that faith, who doesn't have that perspective, this is a fair question to raise. Is if I'm not a believer, I don't believe that all suffering leads to good. I actually believe that suffering would be a bad thing or a dangerous thing or something that is negative most of the time. Tim, you had a comment?
Well, I think this all kind of goes back to our inherent nature in which we feel like things have to have meaning behind them. The only reason why, and I don't know if this is necessarily positive and should be the case, but why Christians find comfort in suffering is because they know it's going to result in some kind of spiritual good for them.
Yeah.
And I mean, theoretically, I guess we should be okay with suffering pointlessly. But by pointlessly, I mean there is no end game for our suffering. It just simply is suffering for the sake of suffering.
Yeah.
But I guess that's kind of what you have to show then to the atheist is like that your suffering is pointless and meaningless without God because it doesn't lead. There's no end result. There is no good that comes ultimately from suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, even like the Buddhist answer to suffering is if you're suffering, just simply stop suffering, which is that's the teaching.
Right.
There's no point in suffering, so stop it. Like just don't do it anymore.
Yeah. I think it is. I think it is an interesting thing that we have to think about, because everyone's going to have a different perspective on this based on the things that they've gone through in their lives and the sufferings that they've experienced. I think it's also important to note too, like there has to be room for compassion in these arguments as well, because I think a lot of times it's easy to just be like, hey, if you were a Christian, like all your pain and suffering would be for the sake of good. It's like, well, there are bound to be things that people have gone through that seem to be almost impossible to turn that way. But I think that's where we have to try to, through time and patience, to make that argument with someone. Blake and then Anna.
I think maybe the way that we handle this kind of conversation is by simply saying, I can only explain these things by God.
Mm-hmm.
How can you explain it without God?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That would be my zinger.
Well, that was kind of where I was going, is I was like, I don't even think that this is like our strongest argument for God,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really more of just an objection to somebody that already believes, because really, like, you can't really explain, like, we can only justify all of this because we already believe in God.
Right.
And then it all makes sense. but like kind of like Blake was saying, like if you don't believe in God, we have to get there first for this to make sense. Because otherwise, like you're gonna sit there and say, well, I don't believe in God, so this is all pointless to me. But for us, it's like, well, this has a bigger purpose in our life. So I
Right.
really think like this is a more of just, and I mean, it's kind of what we already said like, at the beginning. Like this is an objection to the existence of God, but you really can't explain it without God. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my thought.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying, like, I think it's fine to put it on the other person and say, well, if this is not a problem for you because you don't care about pain and suffering, and okay, fine, then you don't have to answer any questions.
Yeah.
But you're the one that seems usually you're the one that seems concerned about this, and you're trying to like figure this out.
Yeah.
And you're the one angry at the fact that my answer is God, you know, and so you have to come up with the alternative answer for this.
Yeah.
Because I can give you what I think the answer is, but I'm telling you that you might not like this initially because you're already not believing in God. But
Yeah.
instead of looking at it as like, I got to find a way to balance out God, my belief in God, and these other things. No, it's like, I find my answer for these things in my belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your answer for these things? Unless you don't care about them. If you don't
Right.
care about them, then okay, we don't have to talk about this at all.
Yeah.
But most of the time, that this would be, it's like what C.S. Lewis said, that was the thing that he thought was his reason for not believing in God, and it wound up being a reason he became a believer in God.
Yeah. Well, I think I think it goes back to the whole argument about evil that we were having at the beginning. Was just if you want to just say that like evil and good don't matter, or like evil, there is no evil in good, or there's no objective right or wrong, kind of the point that Richard Dawkins had to make. Okay, then like argument's over. Like that's where what you're gonna believe. But I think it's when someone comes to that conclusion of like, no, like this pain and suffering shouldn't be happening. Well, how can you say that without there being a God? Or like evil should not exist. Well, how can you say that there is evil if you're not saying that there's any good or evil out there? So I think that's one of the foundational things that you have to kind of drill down to with someone, is to say, all right, if this is really the line you're going to take, this is the natural progression or the natural end of that argument. Huh? Okay. Kelly, you had a comment?
Just to what Blake was saying about the idea that you can't prove a negative, that there is no God now because of pain and suffering, prove that there is by using pain and suffering. Well, we have to flip that argument over.
Right.
What you were saying, and you were giving the supporting evidence, and the logical conclusion supports that.
Right. Yep.
As we answer the question, or approach the question, how do we?
Yeah.
What I was approaching there.
Yep. Tim.
I was just going to say, I think to answer a lot of these questions, we say that God has already solved the problem of suffering in the world. He gave us Jesus. And there's going to be a day where there is no suffering anymore because of Jesus.
Yep.
So those are kind of easy cop-out answers for my singers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's maybe a point that you would want to make with someone eventually in this line of thinking, but you gotta get them to that point before you make that point. So, yeah. So we've talked about this a lot already, but the conclusion here would be pain and suffering do often have a greater purpose, whether we realize it immediately or not. So the fifth question here, and we've talked about this a little bit as well already, but I want to dive into just a little bit in the last couple minutes we have. So who is best suited to know whether suffering is good or bad, man or God? And I know this seems like a bit of a rhetorical question, but I think that this is when you drill down to it, this is one of the primary fundamental sticking points in this argument, is that if you believe that that pain and suffering are only acceptable, if they serve the greater good, or whatever kind of whatever kind of reasoning you want to put to make pain and suffering okay, either man is responsible for determining what that greater good is, or God is. And basically that's the question that I think we need to put in front of people when they have this argument, besides the things that we've already mentioned, is if you're going to believe this, that man is responsible for determining what is good or bad in terms of suffering, what what end results or what causes of suffering are acceptable or not acceptable, that's where all your faith and trust is going to go into. And for me, I would much rather trust that God is going to be the one who determines that, because he has such a greater and higher perspective than any of us have. That's kind of the point. I'll just bring it up briefly here. The point that God makes in Job chapters 38 through 40. Job is claiming that God is acting unfairly, that he doesn't deserve to suffer, that this is all just so unjust, and why is it happening to him? Maybe a little bit of a different argument than exactly what we're talking about here, but I think that basically God answers this by saying he challenges Job's knowledge and comprehension of all the mysteries of the universe. You know, this huge monologue that God goes on in chapters 38 through 40, and kind of puts Job in his place and says, "Who are you to question me? I am God. I have seen all these things. I've created all these things. I have all these things under my power and control. How could you question me?" So I think that it's good to be careful with this point here, because you don't want to just be like, listen, God is just so much bigger and better, and like, how could you even dare question? Like, that would not necessarily want to be the first point that you want to make to someone in this argument. But I think that it is a fair point to raise, is to say, you have two choices here when it comes to the evil and the pain and the suffering that exists in the world. Either man is responsible for, through society or through our own limited perspective on what is happening, or whatever the case is, either man is responsible for determining what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of suffering, or God determines that. And for me, I would much rather place my trust in God, in the God that is described here in Job chapters 38 through 40, than I would in my own limited perspective and understanding on these things. Because God exists above all that we can see and all that we know and all the things that are around us. And so how much better to put our trust in him than to put our trust in ourselves or in some man-made standard. Anna, you had a point?
I was gonna say, kind of with that, like, we can kind of point back to the, like, what we talked about earlier about the subjectivity of, like, that something may seem good to me, it seems bad to someone else, or useless or pointless or whatever. And so I think what you're saying is, like, it does take a level of humility to actually believe this, that, like, God has the better plan and the better perspective on it. However, anybody coming to you with these questions of, like, well, why is there evil, then if they already don't believe in God, they're not going to possess that humility because they don't have any reason to.
Exactly.
So this is a great, like, I guess, way for us to kind of reconcile it in ourselves. But with somebody else, it might be kind of hard for them to really recognize, because, like, I don't even recognize that there's a God.
Yeah.
So there is no perspective outside of myself. But you're right, there's two choices. Like,
Yeah.
you can use this as a way to point you towards a God and being like, that relinquishes our control over that, or our, need to, like, justify all this when it's so subjective. Or you can, like, trust in a higher power to be the objective source of that.
That conversation you'd have with someone about trusting in that higher power and how to get to that point where you could trust in this God, I think that's a separate discussion. But I think this is at least a way to differentiate and kind of show someone, all right, here's where we are different. I'm placing my trust in God. You're placing your trust in man or in something else. Tim, and then Richard.
Well, and I just think a good alternative to show somebody, so if somebody's going to be able to somehow say suffering can be good and give some sort of utilitarian answer as to how suffering can be good, I think a good way to kind of counteract that is by showing them an unsavory, end result of what the ideology would be.
Yeah.
So I think someone, and he's very careful when you're quoting Nietzsche because he's very widely misunderstood, but he had a very romantic notion of what it meant to exist and live beyond good and evil. And ultimately, and I don't know, and personally I don't know how much Nietzsche actually believed in this, or rather it was just a romanticized in his mind, whatever, so you have to be careful with this. These concepts of the Übermensch that are supposed to reject love and compassion and instead embrace progress and power. And by exercising and grabbing that will to power, and by destroying those who are weak, who are merciful, who are kind and gentle, those are Untermenschlich. Those are depraved qualities. that the ultimate good is by making the powerful more powerful.
Right.
And really, when you take a more utilitarian standpoint, is he wrong? If it's more beneficial for 51% of of the world population to exist, it is then the correct thing to do to destroy the 49,
Right.
and to leave only the strongest 51. I mean, it's kind of like this is just a numbers game. So that suffering is good in a utilitarian mindset,
Yeah.
but yet anybody who's willing to accept that, I don't know how to help somebody that's willing to accept that kind of philosophy.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that I think it speaks to the. I'm just going to leave what you said with what it is, because I don't know a better way to summarize it. But Richard, you've got the last comment.
Okay, Robin says, pain and suffering itself may or may not be a means to an end with spiritual benefits. But one human inflicting pain and suffering on another is evil, or a perpetuation of evil.
Yep.
And then Angela says, while there is a greater good, there is and she's speaking from the Christian perspective, while there is a greater good, there is an individual responsibility to act in the interest of God's commands. No matter what, I'm answerable to him, and that's where God judges the individual.
Okay.
So I don't have a comment, but I have a question.
Yeah.
So I thought about Job earlier before we got to this question with something Tim was saying. So maybe this is something that we can just think about and think through. Did Job suffer for righteousness' sake?
Right.
Like, if you're a believer, then you're going to accept that the story is true and everything. So did Job suffer for righteousness? Because most people would say he suffered because of just like the worldly kind of natural disaster kind of thing or whatever. But because we know the dialogue between God and the devil, I think it's a fair question. Did he suffer for righteousness?
Yeah.
Because really, did he suffer for his faith?
Right.
And maybe that's a different way of thinking through some of this, because when we think of suffering in the New Testament, we just think of persecutions, like literally suffering because of I'm preaching the gospel or whatever.
Right.
So you can use Job as a way of showing suffering for a purpose
Yeah.
in a different way.
Yeah, and I think to that point, did Job know that he was suffering for righteousness? Like from his perspective, what was his perspective on that suffering? He doesn't know until the end, and even then, God really doesn't explain it to him. Like God doesn't come down and say, "All right, Job, let me clue you in. Here's what's been happening." Like he just kind of says, "I'm God, and this is what you need to accept."
Unless all suffering is for righteousness for the believer in God,
Yeah.
regardless of if you think it's an attack on your faith or not, because you know the option is to reject God.
Right.
If you don't do that, you are suffering for righteousness.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, could be. All right. Well, we're right at about an hour from when we started, so I'll go ahead and call it here for the class. But really appreciate everyone's thoughts and attention. I had one more question, but this is kind of something we've been talking about throughout. Just I think it's important to be aware of some of the things that we've talked about in terms of being careful with this kind of discussion with someone and not just trying to shove these logical arguments down someone's throat necessarily. But really appreciate the thoughts and comments, guys, and I'll wrap us up with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for today. We're thankful for the time that we've had to gather together to study your word, to worship you, and to pray and to sing songs. I pray, Father, that you will be with us as we go our separate ways. Help us to be lights in this world, to show your truth to all those who we interact with. Be with those of our number who are away from us, whether they are at home or whether they are traveling, whatever the case may be. Help us to continue to find ways to serve one another, to reach out to each other, and to strive to just to seek your will above all else, Father. Lord, we thank you for Jesus, and we pray this all in his holy name. Amen.